Margaret sat on her usual bench in the small park that she had visited every day for the past few years. The air was crisp, and golden leaves drifted down from the trees, a reminder that fall was coming. She sat there alone, as she often did, watching people stroll by. She was in her early 70s, with greying hair neatly pulled back, her wrinkled hands folded on her lap. She wore a heavy wool coat to keep the chill away, and beside her was an old leather purse, her constant companion. It had been years since Margaret had felt true excitement or joy. Her life had once been full: friends, family, a bustling career as a schoolteacher. But as the years passed, friends moved away, her husband had died, and her 2 children were now living in distant cities, absorbed in their own lives. It wasn't that they didn't care for her. They called often. But she felt the weight of solitude more and more each day. As she sat there staring at the birds pecking the ground, a young man walked by. He wore a long coat and carried a small weathered satchel slung over his shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair and thoughtful eyes. Margaret barely noticed him until he stopped directly in front of her bench. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice soft but clear. "Yes," she responded. The man hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "May I sit here for a moment?" Margaret nodded, gesturing to the space next to her. The man sat down carefully, placing his satchel at his feet. For a few moments, they sat in silence. He stared out at the park, as if lost in thought, while Margaret tried to understand why this stranger had chosen her bench when there were plenty of others available. After a minute, he turned toward her again. "You come here often, don't you?" Margaret was taken aback. How did this stranger know? She nodded, unsure of what to say. "I've seen you here before," the man explained. "I walk by this park every day on my way to work, and I've noticed you sitting here, watching the world go by." Margaret felt a small pang of embarrassment. She hadn't realized she was so predictable. "Yes, I suppose I do. It's peaceful here." The man smiled faintly. "I've been wanting to speak to you for some time. I know this might seem strange, but I have something for you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small worn envelope, yellowed with age. Margaret looked at it curiously. "What is this?" she asked, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "Just something that belongs to you," he said cryptically, holding out the envelope for her to take. Margaret's fingers trembled as she accepted the envelope, her mind racing with questions. She hadn't seen this man before, she was sure of it. What could he possibly have that was meant for her? With hesitant fingers, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter, handwritten in a familiar script. Her heart stopped as she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her late husband, Peter. Her vision blurred with tears as she unfolded the letter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The man beside her sat in respectful silence, watching her reaction. Margaret could barely process what she was seeing. The date on the letter was from nearly 40 years ago. She began to read the first few lines and her breath caught in her throat. "My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means the universe has conspired to reunite us in some small way. I wrote this letter a long time ago, knowing that one day you might need a reminder of the love we shared." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she continued reading. It was a love letter, one that Peter had written but never given her. He spoke of their time together, their dreams, their small disagreements, and his overwhelming love for her. It was as though Peter was speaking directly to her from beyond the grave. The young man waited until Margaret had finished reading before he spoke again. "I found it in an old book at a thrift store," he said gently. "The book had a note in the front, signed by your husband, Peter. I tracked down your name through some old records, and I realized this letter was meant for you." Margaret was stunned. Her mind struggled to comprehend the coincidence, the impossibility of it all. How had her husband's letter ended up in a book, in a store only to be found by this stranger? And how had it made its way back to her decades later? She looked at the man, tears still in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. This means everything to me." The young man smiled. "I think your husband wanted you to have it, even after all this time." For the first time in years, Margaret felt a sense of profound connection, not just to her past, but to the present. She realized that love in all its forms was timeless. This letter, lost to her for decades, was a reminder that Peter was still with her, even if not in person. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by a warmth she hadn't known in years. She turned to the young man, her heart filled with gratitude. "You've given me a gift I never expected," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. The young man stood up, giving her a gentle nod. "I think it was Peter who gave you that gift. I was just the messenger." As he walked away, Margaret remained seated on the bench, holding the letter in her hands. The park around her seemed brighter, the sounds of life more vibrant. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. From that day on, Margaret no longer sat alone on the bench feeling isolated from the world. She started reaching out, calling her children more often, visiting old friends she had lost touch with. She even joined a book club, something she had always wanted to do but never found the courage for. And every time she passed the park, she remembered that young man and the letter that had changed everything. It reminded her that life was full of unexpected gifts and that love, once shared, never truly fades.